Thank you all again for joining us for our first ever ABNY virtual policy brief. Adam Grossman Meagher, Senior Vice President, Neighborhood Strategies Planning Division at the New York City Economic Development Corporation, will discuss Sunnyside Yard Master Plan. This new framework will focus on building new public transit, affordable housing, and 60 acres of new open space on a publicly controlled site. Adam is an urban planner with over a decade of experience leading some of New York's most impactful planning and development projects. Throughout his time at New York City EDC, he has worked on major projects that change the face of the city, such as the plan for the Inwood neighborhood in northern Manhattan, MTA bus depot in East Harlem, infrastructure improvements in Coney Island, and the de Blasio administration's ambitious affordable housing plan. Previously, Adam worked at the Department of City Planning. He holds a master's from Harvard Graduate School of Design and a bachelor's from Georgetown. He currently serves as director of Sunnyside Yard at New York City EDC. Without further ado, I will pass the mic to Adam.
Thank you. Sarah, thank you for that welcome. Pardon me. One moment. Okay. Hello, everyone. My name is Adam Grossman Meagher. I am a Senior Vice President in the Neighborhood Strategies Group at EDC. I want to thank Sarah and Laura and Abney for inviting us to speak today. We actually scheduled this event. I think we started talking about it a couple of months ago before we released the Sunnyside Yard Master Plan in early March. And that was only a couple of months, but I think it feels like a lifetime. And obviously the world has changed dramatically since we first conceived this meeting and since we released the plan. I am glad that despite all of that, we are still able to come together and we are able to talk about long-term planning and Sunnyside Yard while still practicing social distancing. Before we jump into the presentation, I want to thank Abney for working with EDC and with City Hall and Mayor's office on the federal stimulus legislation that is so important to New York City and really partnering with the city to make sure that we get our fair share. And I also want to shout out the really important work that Abney is doing around the 2020 census, which is more important than ever, and really working to make sure that every New Yorker is counted. Before we start focusing on Sunnyside Yard, I want to go back to this fact that we are in a very different moment right now than we were when we released the master plan. An unprecedented crisis facing the city, and it has completely reshaped our normal. From the perspective of us at EDC, we transitioned in a matter of weeks to becoming basically a full-time COVID response and recovery agency. And you may have seen in the press some of the ways in which that is playing out. We are leading a massive effort to manufacture PPE, hundreds of thousands of face shields and gowns. There was an article in the New York Times the other day you may have seen about how we worked with the new lab at Brooklyn Navy Yard to basically invent a new kind of simpler ventilator and contracted to produce 3,000 of those for New York City hospitals. My team at EDC has also been very involved in the work that Catherine Garcia, the city's COVID food czar, is doing around feeding New Yorkers and protecting our food supply. And we've also, and this goes to really, I think, the sort of diverse toolkit that we have at EDC, we've been doing a lot of work behind the scenes to kind of find locations for all of the different COVID uses that are needed as part of our response, from places to park ambulances, to food distribution points, to dredging on Pier 94 for the Comfort Hospital ship, to the Surge Hospital at the Brooklyn Cruise Terminal that is due to start receiving patients, I believe, next week. So that is very much our focus and our priority right now. All of that said, I think it's still a really important time to talk about long-term planning, particularly as we think about the challenges that the city and the region will be facing during what we all anticipate will be a very long and difficult recovery. So I'm glad we have this moment. And again, thank you to the ABNY team for making this possible and to all of you for joining us today. So with that, I am going to dive into our presentation. Okay, Yana, I will just call out slides as we advance. Okay, so I'm going to start off, as we always do, with a very brief kind of overview of what is Sunnyside Yard. So we're on the what is Sunnyside Yard slide. So Sunnyside Yard, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, is a massive active rail yard in Western Queens. It has been around for over 100 years, and it is a critical piece of rail infrastructure for both the New York City region and the entire Northeast corridor. It is 180 acres in size, which is massive. That's about the size of Governor's Island. It is shared by multiple regional railroads. It is largely owned, and this is the area in orange, by Amtrak. There is a smaller but still very large portion on the northern side of the yard that is owned by MTA, Long Island Railroad, and there is a smaller, relatively small private parcel owned by General Motors. This is an incredibly busy facility and includes a lot of important rail functions, including storage tracks, places where trains are maintained and serviced. This is actually where Long Island Railroad is staging East Side Access construction and building a new storage yard. For Amtrak, they have a lot of critical functions here, and it also includes the mainline tracks that actually carry passenger trains into and out of Manhattan and Penn Station every day. Those are along the southern edge of the site. So this is a really important and critical facility that needs to remain. Actually, Amtrak has a large plan to invest in it over the coming decades because it is such a critical piece of infrastructure. So going to the next slide, zooming out to kind of the scale of the city and the region. One of the things that makes Sunnyside Yard such an important and strategic site is that it is one of really only 2 places in the entire regional rail network that are points of convergence where all of the trains come together. So as I mentioned, Amtrak trains, also Long Island Railroad, New Jersey Transit trains actually come here as well. This is where they are stored during the morning and evening rush hours. And in the near future, after the completion of the Penn Access project, Metro North trains will actually come through the yard as well via the Hellgate Bridge, which will mean that all of the regional railroads and Amtrak come here. However, none of them actually provide passenger service at Sunnyside Yard today. So you can sort of see in this diagram that there is the potential from Sunnyside Yard to have a 1-seat ride to every part of the New York City region, the massive number of people and jobs that it contains, as well as to every part of the Northeast corridor via Amtrak. So when we think about decking over Sunnyside Yard, one way to think about it, and really the way that the master plan frames it, is as kind of creating new land. Today, the yard is an open air facility. By building a deck over it conceptually, you essentially create a new urban surface that can house urban uses, parks, streets, buildings. It's really an opportunity to do something that New York City has done in its past, but rarely does today, which is create new land. And not just new land, but land that is actually publicly controlled. This is a site that is surrounded by incredibly diverse and vibrant neighborhoods like Long Island City, Astoria, Sunnyside, Dutch Kills, Woodside. It is also, as I noted, incredibly well connected by transit. And so there's really an opportunity here to create public land at a scale that we really don't have in the city today and will not have in the future as we are continuing to run out of land. It's also an opportunity and a really critically important piece of this effort that it is planning that is done in close coordination with the railroads who actually use and depend on Sunnyside Yard every day. So next slide. New York City, as we all know, faces a lot of long-term challenges. Many of those, I think, were very clear to us pre-COVID around things like how do we grow in a managed and sustainable way? How do we deal with and adapt with the threats of climate change and sea level rise? How do we make the city more equitable? How do we lift people up into good paying jobs? And how do we provide the affordable housing that is really the bedrock of working class and middle class communities. In the past, the city has responded to these things, to these kinds of challenges in really big ways by leveraging public land, building, for example, the Mitchell-Lama developments of the mid to late 20th century that provided really a bedrock of affordable housing for a lot of communities. And that continues today in places like Hunters Point South, where we are building out a new affordable and mixed income community with parks and streets and infrastructure. However, we increasingly lack the places to do these kinds of big things at scale. So going to the next slide. The Sunnyside Yard Master Plan, and really the reason that we decided to undertake this at this particular moment in time, is about creating a framework, laying down a set of public priorities that are grounded and really rooted in the reality of how the rail yard works and its rail operations, and really foregrounding those public goods within a plan that is also flexible and can evolve over time. So in other words, we are essentially saying this rail yard, besides being important infrastructure, is really a sort of a civic resource. It is a really unique resource that we can use by working with the railroads to really respond to these challenges that are facing Queens neighborhoods and facing the city. And to make sure that we do that, to make sure that we don't squander that opportunity, we need to start early with a strong plan. And that really goes to the heart of what we are doing with this plan. It's not about spurring development. It's not about building over a rail yard for the sake of doing it as fast as we can, but it's really about making sure that when it happens, it's done in the right way, and that it's done in a way that is really grounded in the needs of communities. So that takes us into the process behind the plan, going to the timeline slide on planning process. So the origins of this effort go back about 6 years to when Amtrak approached the city, saying we have this huge asset in Western Queens. We would like to partner with you to think about the potential of building over it. That led to a piece of work called the feasibility study, which was really a narrowly focused technical document that was trying to answer the question, is it feasible to deck over the yards without compromising rail operations? And essentially the answer it found is yes. It is complicated, it is expensive. There are areas of the yard, specifically the mainline tracks, where the study found it is really too difficult and too costly to deck because of the fact that those tracks are always in operation. But in general, the answer was yes. Now, this was not a plan. It was not intended to be a guiding blueprint for what that overbuild should look like, what it should do. It was intended really just to answer that question. So at that point then, the city and Amtrak decided to continue to work together and partner to produce this master plan. And again, the idea was that a civic resource of this kind of long-term generational importance needs to be grounded in a plan that is rooted in a community dialogue and in the public interest. So that led to an 18-month effort, which I'll talk more about, and finally to the release of the master plan on March 3rd. You can find that plan at sunnysideyard.nyc. There's a website that actually walks you through it, and you can also download the executive summary. And if you're interested, dive into the hundreds of pages of beyond that of the substance of the plan. Next slide. So this timeline kind of breaks down and illustrates what I think was an incredibly intensive and robust public process. This was a conversation that was very much rooted in Western Queens, and a number of my colleagues who are on this call spent really every day for a long time in Western Queens. We did not only kind of the traditional large public meetings and listening sessions, as well as workshops around key issues, but we also did a lot of one-on-one and small group communication, trying to meet people where they are, going to, for example, NYCHA family days or the Woodside Library on a Thursday with kind of a traveling display to kind of educate people about the yard. And then many, many conversations with different stakeholders to understand people's needs and perspectives. Another aspect of that, next slide, was a steering committee that we formed early on. This is about 40 people, hosted and convened by the Deputy Mayor for Housing and Economic Development, and also the Chairman of the Board of Amtrak, Tony Kosha. It is chaired or was chaired by Liz Luskin, the head of the Long Island City Partnership, and Sharon Greenberger, the head of the YMCA of Greater New York. And its membership was really conceived to provide a really wide range of perspectives, both folks who come at this from a citywide or a regional perspective, representing planning groups, constituencies like organized labor, but then also bringing to the table a wide array of people and groups from Western Queens, community boards, small business groups, social service organizations. And we very deliberately tried to make this a group that would be representative of a wide range of perspectives. We wanted to have a dialogue happening kind of within the development of the plan, as well as in the wider public. So this is a group that were not the authors of the plan, but they did advise the city and Amtrak and our consultant team as we were developing ideas and concepts. And more than anything, they really helped to make sure that we had a robust public process. So going to the next slide, again, that process consisted of workshops, public meetings. We did a digital town hall last December for people who maybe have a hard time making it out on evenings to public meetings. We had over 100 participants. We made sure that our materials were always translated into many languages, because Queens is the most diverse place on earth. We wanted to make sure we didn't leave anyone out. So now going to the plan. So master plan snapshot slide. So this is just some of the kind of key numbers and facts about the plan before I start kind of unpacking it. So I mentioned that the yard is 180 acres. The area of the master plan is about 140 acres of that, primarily because the mainline tracks, as you can see, are not proposed to be decked over. About 115 acres is actually land that would be created by building the deck over the rail yard. When you look at this, or you look at really any image of the Sunnyside Yard Plan, we always have to remind ourselves that this is at a scale of planning that we rarely, if ever, kind of get the opportunity to do in New York City. It is not the size of a site or a block, it's the size of a neighborhood. And really the way we think about it as an extension of the neighborhoods around it, bringing those neighborhoods together and creating a new place. So the other thing to really keep in mind is that because of that size and because of the complexity of this endeavor, this is something that would take place over many phases over a long period of time. We think of this as a generational plan. So we're talking in terms of decades, even 50 to 100 years to see this fully realized over many phases. So it's important to kind of realize that this is really not something that would happen all at once or even in 2 or 3 phases. It would happen over a very long period of time. That said, the kind of rolled up numbers of the master plan include 12,000 homes, which would be entirely affordable. I'll talk more about that later. That's a little more than half of the proposed development program. The balance would be allocated to different types of commercial uses, office, retail, and what the plan calls comdustrial, which I'll come back to, essentially kind of light industrial uses mixing with office uses. And then finally, a lot of space, over 3 million square feet, allocated to what we call social infrastructure and also to institutional space. A huge part of the plan is open space. About 40% of the master plan is proposed to be new open space, as well as new transportation facilities. And all of this taken together has the potential to create a large number of jobs, both permanent and construction. So going to the next slide around accommodating rail needs. So as I said, this plan, big picture, is really trying to do 2 things. It's trying to set out those public priorities informed by a public conversation. And then it is trying to root those in the realities of the rail yard, how it functions, and what it will look like in the future. There have been a lot of proposals over the years at Sunnyside Yard for different ideas for projects and things like relocating the Javits Convention Center. None of those have really been based in kind of the rail yard and how it operates. So we have spent a tremendous amount of time and resources. We think about it almost as the iceberg under the waterline of this plan, working very closely with Amtrak and also Long Island Railroad to really understand the yard on a deep level. As I said, a lot of different functions here. And really, when you think about enclosing a rail yard that is open air today, you have to think about things like, where do the columns that support the deck go? How do you work around existing tracks, but also make space for new tracks that may be needed in the future? You have to do things like provide ventilation, lighting, in some cases, basically reconstructing the overhead power lines that provide power to Amtrak trains. And this also involves looking into the future. And that's actually another part of the reason that this planning is happening now. Amtrak, actually, around the time they came to the city, was embarking on a master plan of their own to really invest in the yard in a really significant way over the next 20 years or so. So they recognize that this is sort of a unique moment in time to come up with a plan and a vision for overbuild that syncs with their needs and their investments over time. In other words, planning now so that we don't miss the opportunity to do this in the future. So we've had a great collaboration with Amtrak. They are the co-authors of the plan, and that has been really a critical piece. So going to the next slide, designing a deck. So one of the challenges here is sort of a three-dimensional spatial challenge, which is how do you bring neighborhoods together onto a street network over the yard? And how do you do that in a way that is accessible, that is well connected? One of the challenges there is that Sunnyside Yard, by and large, is at the same grade as surrounding streets and blocks. So it's not sunken, which means that any deck is going to be at least 20 feet or so over that surface, which means it will be somewhat elevated. So previously, when the feasibility study had looked at this issue of deck height, it used basically kind of the default clearance heights that the railroads ask for when someone is, for example, building a bridge over a rail yard. And the diagrams on the left is this kind of a heat map that shows you what that ended up resulting in. The dark colors mean higher elevations. So you can see that the elevation of the deck would really be significantly higher than the surrounding neighborhoods. And the section drawing here on the left is really what you would see walking across one of the bridges over the yard, which in the plan really become kind of the major north-south streets in Sunnyside Yard. And what you would have if you didn't kind of alter those clearance heights is really a condition where you would have walls on either side of those bridges, very disconnected. What we were able to accomplish working with Amtrak in this master plan is basically figure out how we could bring those heights down and smoothly connect to those bridges so that we would have really a continuous urban surface that feels normal, that feels like a regular part of the city. And one analog for that historically is what used to be called Terminal City, north of Grand Central Terminal in Manhattan. That is a massive overbuild. When you walk around Park Avenue and those streets, you're walking over a massive train shed. But you don't necessarily perceive that or know that because it feels like a part of the city just like any other part. And that's really what we're trying to do here is make it so that it really feels like a continuous extension of the neighborhoods around it. So now I'm going to actually, Yana, if you could go to the street network slide. So just another aspect of that is the way that all the different street grids of Western Queens kind of crash together at Sunnyside Yard. So another part of what we were trying to do is to kind of reconcile those grids and bring them together into a street system that is human scaled, walkable, but also works for future development. So what you can see here in this diagram is that the bridges really become these important connections over and through the yard. There would be new pedestrian and bike bridges over the mainline tracks to supplement them. There would be two new major east-west corridors. We call the northern and southern corridors. Not very imaginative, but I'm sure they'll get better names later. And these are really kind of conceived as 21st century complete streets that provide adequate space for all users. Pedestrians, bikes, buses, cars, really designed from scratch to accommodate all modes. And then within that, a network of what are conceived as shared streets, a model you see a lot in Europe and other parts of the world, but not as much in New York City, where really pedestrians and cyclists are prioritized. And there is vehicular access, but it is limited, and streets are really designed in a way that feels like public space. So it is that kind of network that creates those connections. There are places on the north side of the yard where the elevations do require kind of a jump. So we spent a lot of time with the design team looking at strategies for how you can use stairs and elevators and ramps to create sort of public spaces that are inviting and welcoming and do not feel kind of cut off from the areas around them. So going back to the master plan pillars slide. The outline of the plan, the chapters that you'll see if you go and take a look, is really built around the 6 major themes that we heard over and over again during that 18-month public conversation. Sometimes we call them the pillars of the plan, and I'm going to go through each one in turn. I'll just point out about the kind of panorama rendering view on this slide that it is kind of almost hard even for us sometimes to see where downtown Long Island City ends and the neighborhoods around the yard end and Sunnyside Yard picks up. And that's really a function of, and I'll talk about this a bit more later, how we tried to come up with a framework, a scale, a plan that would feel connected to and in a context that is recognizable in Western Queens. So going to 2 slides later, Western Queens open space. So something that is very much a lived reality for anyone in this part of the city is that it is dramatically underparked. Even for New York City, the access to open space, and particularly to the kind of larger parks that provide kind of opportunities for recreation, is very limited. Going to the next slide. The plan responds to that by proposing 60 acres of open space. Now, there was a question that we confronted early on, which was, everyone sort of agrees we need a lot of open space, but how do you allocate it and arrange it? And we actually gave people different options to look at. One was a kind of concentrated Central Park style, put it all in one place, or have a bunch of small pocket parks and playgrounds. And what we landed on was essentially 3 or 4 neighborhood scale parks, the types of parks that provide places for ball fields and sports and play. Those were located, as you can kind of see here, mostly at the perimeter of the yard. For example, tripling the size of the existing Lou Ladati Park, which is next to Sunnyside Gardens. And this was deliberate because people said, look, if we're going to have new parks, we want them to be close to us, to where we live today. They can also help to address that elevation issue I talked about by really creating space for a smooth and kind of gradual transition to the height of the deck. They would be connected by a greenway, which is over a mile long, and really not a greenway in the sense of just a bike lane, but almost a boulevard, New York City's first car-free boulevard that would be entirely green space and open space. Really the width of a street, providing both kind of passage and connections for pedestrians and bikes, but also parks and space for recreation. So going to the next slide, this is a rendering of, I think, the East Park that would be close to Woodside. Gives you a sense of both the scale of the park and the scale of buildings around it. And then the next image is along Skillman Avenue, where we propose a kind of linear park running along the north side of the street and providing dedicated space for pedestrians and cyclists, green space for a very industrial part of Long Island City. Next, social infrastructure. So this is a term we use a lot. And it's really just a fancy term for the public uses and facilities that make the city work and make neighborhoods livable and healthy. Everything from institutions like LaGuardia Community College to healthcare to public libraries and public schools. These are sort of the building blocks of any neighborhood. So the plan really sees, first of all, makes significant space for these uses. And that's kind of the areas that you see in kind of blue or purple here. We did analyses around making sure that there is space for enough libraries, enough schools, et cetera. But there's another, and I think important reason for this network and kind of prioritizing it as a layer of the plan, which is that there is this issue when you create a new place of how it feels public, how it feels democratic and part of the city. There have been, I think, a lot of criticisms, I'm sure we've all read and talked about Hudson Yards as a place that I think for a lot of people does not feel that way. And so we felt that the best way, and the most kind of foolproof way to make Sunnyside Yard feel authentically part of its surroundings and connected to neighborhoods is to have public uses and public open space that will draw people in, that send a strong signal that this is a public place, that it belongs to everybody. It might be a place, if you live in Astoria, that you take your kids to school, or if you live in Sunnyside, you go to a library or go to a doctor's appointment. And this is what helps to make it really a real part of the city over time. Next slide, switching to transportation, is around Sunnyside Station. This is another way, I think, in addition to open space, in which the process really shaped the plan. Sunnyside Station is not a new idea. It goes back at least 20 years, really longer. It was a part of the discussion around East Side access in the early years of planning for that project. And it is basically a new regional rail station serving initially Long Island Railroad that would be located in the western part of the yard and would provide commuter rail service for Western Queens. Over time, because of the convergence that I talked about, that could also be served by New Jersey Transit, Metro North, and Amtrak, really creating that regional hub that the city doesn't really, that Western Queens doesn't have today. And this could be even more powerful if it is accompanied by a different set of policies around regional rail, particularly lowering the fare so that it is more accessible to New York City residents and then can help to shift some of the burden off of overcrowded subways. So we heard a lot of support and a lot of interest in this that predates the plan. And as a result, we really identified this as kind of the phase one. Before there is any development, any decking at scale, Sunnyside Station, both because it is a critical part of the plan, but also because it is really has the potential to be a powerful new transportation option for Western Queens. So one of the things that we announced when the plan, the city will committed to provide resources toward this in an ongoing discussion with MTA because we feel so strongly that it is really the critical part of the plan that should be built first. So going to the next slide around transportation strategy. I talked about streets and I talked about Sunnyside Station. Another aspect of the plan here that is also around creating new transit capacity is creating a new bus rapid transit line that would travel the southern corridor, the one that is alongside the mainline tracks. And again, because we get to design streets from scratch here, we get to create a facility that would be entirely separated from other vehicular traffic and could operate more like a subway, creating a new connection between Queens and Manhattan. The plan also looks at the very long-term possibility of creating a new subway line in Queens and really calls for a serious alternatives analysis to look at the various proposals for that have been made over the years, some of which actually would involve a new station at the southeastern part of the yard close to Lululadati Park. So going to the next slide and shifting to affordable housing. So this is kind of the third major way in which I think the community conversation that we had really shaped the plan. When we set out, I don't think we necessarily envisioned that housing at Sunnyside Yard would be all affordable. But what we heard, I think, was first and foremost, a deep and abiding concern about maintaining the diversity of Queens over time. The fact that it has always been a welcoming home for immigrants, for working and middle-class families, and a real fear that that is slipping away. So that connects with this idea of a sort of one-of-a-kind, once-in-a-lifetime civic resource. And I think the more we looked at it, the more we came to the conclusion that this resource had to be leveraged to really sort of ensure that that diversity and that affordability of Queens is maintained well into the future for future generations of New Yorkers. So for that reason, the plan makes a very strong and bold commitment that all of the housing should be affordable. Within that commitment, about half of the homes would be for very low income New Yorkers. So what that means in terms of today's kind of affordability language is about 3,000 units for families that earn less than half of area median income, and another 3,000 for those earning even less than that. So these are, for example, a family of three earning $28,000 a year. The other half of the homes would be around moderate income affordable home ownership, because we also heard a lot of interest in kind of more opportunities for home ownership, for wealth building. And so half of the homes at Sunnyside Yard would be that. Really looking kind of at the Mitchell-Lama program as kind of the inspiration and model, and really kind of mixing these homes together to create a really sort of genuinely mixed and equitable community. Going to the next slide. So alongside the need to just have affordable housing and have deeply affordable housing and home ownership, we heard a lot around kind of what that housing looks like in the context of a community and how it gets created and who owns and makes decisions about it over time. So for example, a lot of interest in public forms of ownership, such as community land trusts. So the plan makes a commitment to explore those and to really to embrace those kinds of forms of ownership. Also a real focus on how we can leverage what would be over time a really huge investment and amount of construction to lift up and assist MWDBE developers, and also to really prioritize community-oriented developers and nonprofits. We really see this kind of looking at some of the large planned neighborhoods of the past and trying to kind of model what is good, but also learn from their lessons and mistakes. And one of those, I think, is a lot of 20th century developments that were very cut off from their surroundings. We really think of this as a mixed income community, a mix of not just incomes, but ages, lifestyles, backgrounds, really all integrated together. And in a context, again, in contrast to some of the developments of the past, that is well connected to the rest of the city by transit, that has amenities, social infrastructure, and is really a complete neighborhood. So going to the next slide, housing for Queens. In terms of scale, it is important, and I guess maybe this is the fourth way that I'll mention that the process really shaped the plan. This is not a plan that maximizes density. It does not propose the tallest buildings that could feasibly be built here. Rather, it really tries to find a balance between a level of density that supports affordable housing, that really allows for commercial and social infrastructure to happen at scale, but is also at a physical scale that is recognizably part of Queens. So we looked at the different neighborhoods, and they all are really different surrounding the Yard. And we kind of zeroed in on this mid-density typology that you see throughout Queens and other parts of the city, the kind of mid-rise apartment building that really provides the bulk of a lot of the kind of affordable housing that makes up Queens. And so we really look to that scale. So most of the plan, and you can see this kind of running from east to west all the way through, is at that kind of medium scale. Buildings with kind of a 8 or so story base with some portions above, really kind of creating a familiar and sort of pedestrian oriented scale. There would also be some lower rise buildings closer to Sunnyside Gardens. And then more high-rise buildings in the 30 to 50 story range would really be concentrated along the north side of the Yard. And that's for a few reasons. One is that it is close to downtown Long Island City, where you have actually much taller buildings today. One is that it is close to the one subway line in Queens that actually has unused capacity, which is the M&R under Northern Boulevard. And finally, putting taller buildings there allows for open spaces to receive southern exposure and to have more light as a result. So going to the next slide around density, this is just a heat map that kind of shows the density proposed for Sunnyside Yard and how it relates to density in the neighborhoods around it. And you can see that it is kind of in that kind of largely in that medium range with some high-rise areas along the northern side. Around jobs and commercial space, this is a part of the plan I'll just touch on, but it is actually a really big part. We look at basically the new economy that has emerged in Western Queens that is kind of bringing together the information or white collar economy with kind of the making of things, where you have corporate headquarters, you have life sciences companies, you have small businesses, you have a lot of arts and cultural institutions, and then you also have strong industrial areas where companies like Boyce Technologies are preparing to manufacture the ventilators that I referenced at the beginning that we're going to make. And with this comes a real opportunity to connect commercial development and commercial growth, not just physically to areas like downtown LIC or to the Studio District in Astoria, but also to a workforce. There is actually an incredible array of institutions today, LaGuardia, obviously, but also CUNY School of Law, schools like Aviation High School. So the plan actually proposes a new education and research campus at the western end of the Yard, close to Sunnyside Station, that would really be kind of an academic anchor for to really connect this expanding economy to a workforce across Queens and across the city. So going to resiliency and sustainability, and as I move toward wrapping up, I will not spend a lot of time on this, which is a shame because it's actually a huge part of the plan. And if you're interested, I would really urge you to go and download this part of the plan. It is really built around 4 principles: carbon neutrality, embracing circular systems, leveraging Sunnyside Yard to support the green economy, and around really adapting to climate change, which is a reality that we are already living with and will continue to live with. So some of the things that the plan does, for example, are around embracing mass timber as a building construction type, which really has not happened a lot in New York City, but is happening in other cities around the world. It has the twin advantages of serving as a carbon sink, so it helps to achieve that carbon neutrality goal. And it's also lighter weight, which means it requires less deck structure to support it. Going to the next slide, there are a lot of different approaches here, some of them very much things that are being done today, others that are a little more forward-looking into the future, anticipating new technologies. These include widespread use of energy generation like solar, potentially using heat, waste heat generated by the trains underneath the deck to generate energy. Also a lot of energy storage technologies, and really creating a surface of streets and parks and buildings that can absorb all of the stormwater that the yard would receive in an intense rain event, and detain it so that it actually has no impact on the sewer system during those events. And that would actually mean that building this deck would mean there would be less runoff from Sunnyside Yard than there is today. So going to the next slide, finally, going back to this idea of workforce, how can we leverage over a long period of time this huge undertaking, these sustainability technologies that will be needed here to meet these goals to really support the green economy? And this is where I think the plan has a lot of resonance with other plans and policy proposals around, for example, the Green New Deal, which also thinks about using kind of the response to climate change as a way to generate a more equitable economy. So that goes back to the idea of connecting to the institutions that are already in Queens today, programs like Urban Upbound, but also creating this new institution to really take these technologies, help develop these technologies, and then train the workforce that will actually build them at Sunnyside Yard and in other parts of the city. So finally, I will end on a subject that is maybe not as flashy as new train stations and boulevards and parks, but in some ways is the most important piece of all, which is around governance. So the question that everyone always asks after seeing this is, well, how do you actually make that happen? And how do you ensure that a master plan, which is after all not a rezoning, it is not a set of public approvals, it is not a real estate transaction, all of those things would have to come in the future. What it is really a vision and a set of strategies and kind of a technical blueprint for achieving it. So how do you make sure it sticks and how do you make sure it happens? So our sort of response to that is to form a nonprofit planning entity for Sunnyside Yard. This is something the city and Amtrak announced that we will do when we release the master plan. The notion is that this organization would really be the long-term steward of the master plan, responsible for ensuring that it is implemented really in line with both the technical blueprint and the core commitments of the plan, and also ensuring that public visibility and public participation is always a part of decision-making for the yard. In other words, we don't want the process that we went through to be a one-time thing. We want it to be really part of the DNA of Sunnyside Yard going forward. So we envision that organization as having public representation, both elected officials and from local community, so that there is really kind of a forum for dialogue and shared decision-making about the yard over time. And really kind of keeping future administrations honest and kind of ensuring that the things that we're talking about here really are delivered. So I will end on that note. This is really not an exercise, as you can see, in maximizing financial feasibility or ensuring that overbuild happens as fast as possible. It's really an aspirational and generational plan that is about using public land, generating public land to meet the major challenges that we